Racism, Representation, and Comic Books. Rene Garcia, Social Psychology 351, Section 6. So racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed at a particular person or group because of their race or ethnicity. It's essentially, I'm better than you because of the way I look or where I come from, or it's also, I believe you're inferior to me because of the way you look or where you come from. Representation, on the other hand, is defined as the description or portrayal of someone or something in a particular way or being as a certain nature. So the reason I framed or I used these two ideas as the center point of my presentation is because representation, negative representation at least, can really reinforce negative stereotypes and reinforce racism as we see it. Whereas on the other hand, positive representation can positively reinforce self-esteem and self-pride, and it can actually go a long way in actually destroying and breaking down these barriers of stereotypes and of racism. So that's why, like, they're kind of like two spectrums. You can either use representation as something very harmful or something very good. The book defines institutionalized racism as racist attitudes that are held by the vast majority of people living in society or a community where stereotypes and these discriminations are the norm. And the reason I kind of took institutionalized racism as an example, or as the main definition for what the book says, is because the way that representation works is it's not usually overt. It's usually institutionalized. It's usually something that's very, like, not hidden, but something that isn't eye-popping, like isn't what you'd usually associate racism with. It's just these reinforcements of stereotypes, and it's the reinforcement over and over and over again, so that these stereotypes and these discriminations become the norm. The book has a very good example of this, whereas if you're living in a society or in a community where minorities and or women are not usually given positions of power or not given the chance to rise up, and they usually hold menial tasks, you're more likely to have negative views or negative attitudes towards their ability to work, because you see them having these low-paying jobs. So you automatically assume that because they all have these low-paying jobs, their work ethic is very, like, low, which usually isn't the case. What does the research say? So Dan Mastro did a research, really researching how representation, both negative and positive representation, can affect somebody. And the research shows that having or seeing a lot of negative representation of your race, such as like the typical terrorist Muslim in these movies, or the criminal African American person in like shows and TV, can reinforce these harmful stereotypes. And if you're part of that race or that ethnicity, and you're seeing these very negative portrayals of your own race, then it can lead to like having very low self-esteem. Like, you don't actually feel good, essentially, about like who you are. It can also kind of lead into harmful behaviors towards other races and reinforcing that. And there's an example that I'll get into a little later about like how something like that, how negative representation can lead to actual kind of like harmful actual behaviors. On the other hand, positive representation can lead to a very high self-esteem and a good sense of pride, and that's usually what we'd want in society. We don't want to bring people down. We always want to lift them up. So let's get into the first example. The very first example I wanted to use was Black Panther, just because, the Marvel movies. Black Panther and Infinity Wars are very topical right now, and they're very good movies, so if you haven't watched them, I do recommend that you go watch them. But actor and activist Terry Crews kind of wrote a short opinion piece on USA Today about his feelings of how black representation in media has evolved, especially with Black Panther and how it's such a landmark for African Americans in filmmaking, at least. And in the next slide, I'll kind of show you how in comic books at least, African American representation hasn't been the best, especially in the early years. But like how we've come so far and where we are now. So here we have a couple examples of black representation in comics. To the left is where comics very much started in the very early 30s and 40s and 20s, and then to the right is kind of where we are now in modern day comics. So to the left we have two examples with Captain Marvel and the Spirit. Both of these were white-led superhero books, but they both had something in common where they had a African American helper. And as you can see on the covers, they had very much exaggerated features, very dark skin and very big lips. And they weren't very much in roles of, or they weren't in lead roles or roles that helped very much. They're mostly there as support, cleaning up, and as the comical relief. And this is kind of where comics started. Comics were in the early days a very cheap source of entertainment for children, but it was very much white focused and white centric. To the right we have a couple of examples of modern day comics. Black Panther being probably one of the most popular ones at the moment, Luke Cage probably not far behind, and Miles Morales, and there are a lot more. But we're in a time where comics, where African Americans are the superheroes. They are the lead characters in these books. Miles Morales is even getting his own movie, and Black Panther has already had his own. I mean, they're in the spotlight. They're superheroes. They're doing they're not just characters in the background anymore. They're fighting crime. They're leading nations like Black Panther, or they're just being kids kind of finding out how to do things, like in the case of Miles Morales. So yeah, there's a very big distinction between the two, and we've come very much a long way from where we used to be. So finishing off the Black Panther side, while Black Panther was not the very first black-led superhero movie, Blade actually was, and it preceded it a couple of years. It was the very first with a predominantly black cast, black director, and a black writer, and the studio that made the soundtrack was very African American centric. It featured a lot of African American, I think if not all African American artists on both the soundtrack and the original score. And just to quote Terry Crews himself from the article, "Change may be slow and hard fought, but as long as we never give up, change it is inevitable." So on the flip side, how not to do representation, I guess, how representation can reinforce negative stereotypes. In 2017, Marvel launched a comic event titled Secret Empire that saw Captain America being outed as a secret Hydra agent. And if you don't know, Hydra is the equivalent, or it's a fascist group in the comic books that worked alongside the Nazis during World War II. And while the Nazis were defeated, Hydra is still very prevalent, with characters like Baron Zemo and the Red Skull trying to take over the world and kind of force their fascist ideologies upon the world. So to see Captain America, the good old red, white, and blue son of liberty and the pursuit of happiness and everything like that, being outed as a fascist secret agent was kind of both disrespectful to fans and a step backwards to some people. And for some people, it kind of showed, it kind of justified their hate and their kind of negative ideologies. Now, I don't believe that Captain America and the outing of him as a Hydra agent kind of made people do hateful things or think hateful things, but it did reinforce it. And that's kind of the goal. While representation doesn't create negative attitudes or make people do negative things, it does reinforce their ideas if they already have it existing. Which makes it unsurprising that Captain America and Hydra memorabilia were at the far right, Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville last year. Again, I don't believe that this comic book led to the actual rally or anything like that, but to see the memorabilia and the Hydra logo pop up within Charlottesville, to some fans, it was they weren't surprised. It wasn't Um, it was kind of expected to see, just because you have this symbol of America, peace and liberty, and everyone can be what they want, turned into something for fascist and something that represents fascism. So to see it at the far right rally wasn't surprising. Um, and if you guys don't know, the Unite the Right rally was the one rally last year where one person was run over and unfortunately died, and a couple of other people were very seriously beat. And yeah, it wasn't a very good time. Lastly is Latino representation in comics. So I myself as a Latino male, I read comics predominantly, but I still don't get a lot of representations. Of the current Marvel books, there are 0 with any lead characters that are Latino, and of the 44 DC comic books, there are only 3. Bane Conquest being one, Sideways being another, and Green Lanterns with Jessica Cruz being the third. At the moment, Hispanics and Latinos are the second biggest population in America, but are severely underrepresented in comics. So, on a positive note and a positive story for Latino and representation, I've always been a big fan of heroes and superheroes in comics since I was a kid, but I actually never picked a comic up till I was 18, till I was out of high school and had a job and was able to put down my own money. And one of the very first comics I ever picked up was All New Ghost Rider that came out in 2014. That was written by Felipe Smith, a Latino himself. I believe he's Argentinian. He lived in Argentina for a bit, came up to the United States, and then lived in Japan, then came back to the US to write for Marvel, and he's been doing a lot of things. Like, he's written for Marvel, he's doing his own independent book, he's an artist at Nickelodeon for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle series, so he's a very big name kind of within the circle of comics. But the story that he wrote was about a Latino teenager living in, I believe, central Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles. And when I was reading the book, it filled me with a lot with pride, because here's a character that I can see myself as. I can put myself in his shoes. The city that he lives in is very much like the city that I live in. His skin color is very much similar to the skin color that I have. And he kicked ass. He fought for his little brother who was in a wheelchair. He has a spirit of vengeance basically in him, and he turned him into the Ghost Rider, and it's just so cool. Not only as a comic, but seeing this Latino as in the center and forefront of a comic book, and not trying to hide who he is, and being very much involved in his culture. As of right now, they actually canceled his book, so it's a very unfortunate. But he is part of the Avengers now, so if you picked up the new Avengers run, you'd see him, and it's good seeing a Latino very much in the center of Marvel as a pillar of a Marvel comic. So how do we fix the issue? I believe that diversity in comics and in the writers and in the artists will greatly improve the quality of representation. I do think better representation of all races, genders, and creeds is one of the best way to destroy harmful and negative stereotypes.